So I wanted to start out today with a question. Have you ever had a time in your life where, you're thinking about doing something, it's a really bad idea, but you decide to do it anyway? And then when you get into it, you have confirmation it was a bad idea. Yet it's a worse idea than you even thought. Well, I was kind of thinking about a situation like that for me this week. Now, this was a number of years ago. Hopefully I'm a bit wiser now. I can't confirm that for sure, but I think so. This is kind of back almost 30 years ago, so before Bonnie and I were together or anything. And when I lived in New York City, one of the sports that I liked was rock climbing. Now, if you live in New York City, rock climbing happens a lot indoors. You go into gyms and so forth. But of course, I like to go outside, so I would go up to upstate New York, or I'd come up here to go climbing. And about a year into I'll call my climbing career, that is not even close to true, sort of thing, my friend Steve and I worked together. And Steve and I also rock climbed together. And our work was going to take us out to Nevada. So we were supposed to go out to Las Vegas, and we had to go out there for a conference. So we agreed that we'd actually go out a couple days early, and we'd go climbing in a place called Red Rock Canyon. It's about a half hour from Vegas. Gorgeous place. Now, what I had not realized, this is the United States, it's North America. How different can cliffs in Nevada be from cliffs in New Hampshire? Well, you all know what New Hampshire looks like, right? Well, that's what Nevada looks like. It's an entirely different set of minerals. Much of it's got a sandstone composition as opposed to a heavy granite composition. It also fractures very differently. And the reason that's important is the way you climb primarily is through rock fractures, where it cracks and chips away and so forth. On the East Coast, rock fractures primarily horizontally. As you go out west, rock tends to fracture vertically. Just because you're wondering, vertical cracks are much harder to climb than horizontal cracks are. Horizontal is like a ladder, right? This is something very different. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. So Steve and I head out to Red Rock Canyon, and we go out there, and we look at it, and we kind of hike up a little bit, or kind of scramble up, where it's kind of you're hiking, but you're just on all four limbs. So we go up about 100 feet, we get to a ledge, it's a narrow ledge, and we're on a vertical cliff. And I'm like, I could climb that. Now, I do want to do an aside. Done properly, key thing is properly, rock climbing is a very safe sport. That as you climb, you actually just put gear into the rock, and if you're roped up, you feed your rope through the gear. If you fall, your friend locks off the rope, you don't hit the ground. That's a good thing. Right? Done improperly, and I can confirm, done improperly, it is not a safe sport. So we're starting off about 100 feet off the ground from this ledge. I start climbing. I start placing my gear, which I was not very skilled at. And I start clipping my rope in, and I get almost to the end of the climb. The cliff's pretty short. It's about 60 feet. I'm about 10 feet from the end of the cliff. But of course, it's also the hardest part of the climb. So now I'm 50 feet off the ledge where Steve is, with another 100 feet below that. And what I have to do is I have to kind of grab underneath the rock, because the rock bulges out, lean backwards, and then stand up and reach over. Well, as I lean backwards, that puts tension on the rope against all the gear. And as I stand up, because my gear is not properly placed, my rope literally lifts the gear out of the rock and slides all the way down. I literally hit Steve right where he's contacted into the rope. So now I'm looking at a 50-foot ground fall with a likely bounce to another 100 feet to the ground. And I begin to sweat, and I begin to shake. And then something that commonly happens with climbers, there's a term called getting gripped, where you're so frightened that you literally cannot move. And I was completely gripped. But here's what happens. You're holding on, you can't move, but you can't hold on forever. So people literally fall from the gripped position because you're just frozen into your hands just open, and you fall. And this is what I'm facing. And I don't know what I'm going to do. And Steve starts, Jim, you can do this. You've climbed harder climbs than this. You totally have the ability to do this. And Steve begins to talk me through it. And I relax. And I start moving again. And obviously I made it. I climbed out, and I made it to the end. But the reason I survived had to do with the fact that the person who was with me was someone I had trusted, someone I had built a relationship with, someone who I looked at as part of my team. We worked together and we climbed together. Because if I had been with someone else, someone I did not know as well, I probably wouldn't have trusted their advice. But when Steve told me he knew I could do it, I know Steve had seen me do it before. He had earned the right to speak into my life and for me to take it as truth and see it. So the thing I want to talk about this week, as we continue our series, Life on Purpose, I want to talk about the fact that we each need to build our team, that we each need to make a distinct effort to have people in our lives to help us live our lives more effectively, but also just enjoy our lives more. Because as we've been talking about throughout this series is that we were all born with a purpose. We are all here to do something meaningful. But living life with purpose and living life on purpose are not easy things to do. Because as we've said, there are a bazillion things that we have to do. There's work stuff and home stuff and volunteer stuff. And geez, we'd like to enjoy ourselves once in a while. And if you're a Christian, you feel like you want to kind of bring God's stuff into your life. But if we try to make just a huge task list in all these categories, we get overwhelmed and we don't get anywhere. But we don't want to start throwing things out because these things are all important expressions of who we are. All these things are important. What we want to do is simply bring some order to it because these things are part of our human nature. All of those things, our profession or whatever we do with the majority of our time is part of our human nature. Taking care of our families, taking care of our homes, taking care of our friendships and relationships is part of our human nature, as well as enjoying ourselves. Serving people and connecting with God is all part of our human nature, and they're all healthy expressions of our human nature. So we want to incorporate those things in our lives. But how do we do that? If it gets away from us so easily, and it feels so busy so easily, how do we do it? Well, as we've mentioned, we don't try to do it with a task list. What we do is we do our best to live according to our God-created nature, to live consistent with our God-created nature. So how do we do that? How do we understand our nature? How do we decide how we should live so we can live according to our nature? Well, just as we talked about last week, a good place to start is in the beginning, the creation story. Remember last week we looked at this verse. It said, God said, let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness. So this paints a really important picture for us. Because we have those two words. We talk about image and likeness. And although those two words seem like they say the exact same thing, they're slightly different. Because we look at the idea of image, the idea there is that we have the essence of God, meaning that we were created with the basic nature of God. That's what it means to be created in God's image. When it talks about likeness, it means that we're alike God, meaning we have a close resemblance, but we're not identical. So we have that basic nature of God, but we are not God. We have our faults, we have our failings. But when we're living in the fullness of our nature, the fullness of who we were created to be, those best aspects come through us. Those aspects of God's loving nature begin to shine through us. And we find we have more productive lives, more purposeful lives, and much, much more enjoyable lives. So the more we can understand about those aspects of God's nature that come through us, the more we're able to live according to our nature. I mean, last week we talked about a really important one. The importance of taking time to rest, to actually actively, which sounds kind of funny, but actively rest, actually reset yourself, to take time to not just go, but actually lean into it and rest. So this week I want to look at another part of God's nature that I think is well reflected in us, but again, we have to make a point to develop it. And this aspect of God's nature actually comes from this exact same verse that we're looking at here. Because if you look at this verse, it's structured kind of funny. It said that God said, but then he uses the pronouns us and our. Now, as Christians, we are monotheistic, meaning that we believe that there is one God. So God should be a singular noun. Yet it uses us and our, which are plural pronouns. Why is that the case? Well, because we believe that God exists in what we call three distinct persons. We have God the Father, which is kind of what we generally think of as God. We have God the Son, which is Jesus. And then we have the power of God that dwells within us, the Spirit of God, that we call the Holy Spirit. Now, just so if that confuses you, it confuses everybody. No one fully understands the Trinity. You just can't. But the key thing to understand is that somehow God is one and three at the same time. Now, what that means then is that God actually exists in relationship. That the very fundamental aspects of God's nature is that God is naturally relational. And in fact, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells us that God is complete and perfect. So that means that living in relationship is part of God's nature of being complete. And since we have the basic nature of God, that means relationships are a key part of us feeling complete, being complete. We are not meant to go through life alone. Now, oftentimes people will talk about this idea of we're not meant to be alone, and they'll use that as a fact that you need to get married, sort of thing, that you need to have a partner in life. And of course, having a partner in life is good if it's the right partner, right? But I think it's a much, much, much bigger thing than that. That relationships could go through every aspect of our lives. That we have our family relationships, families, the family of birth. But also when I lived in New York City, a lot of people had their family of choice. The reason that a lot of people move to places like New York City is that they had a really hard home life and wanted someplace really new. And so they go to New York City and they start developing a new family that they're not connected to by blood. But they love each other just as much and they take care of each other just as much. And I think that happens everywhere, that we have our family of choice as well as our family of birth. So what that tells us is that in order for family and relationships to be healthy, they need to be something we do intentionally, that we actually have to make a choice to invest in our relationships and to develop healthy relationships. Here's the problem. Sometimes it's just hard to get along with people, right? It's just, people are challenging, right? Honestly, people are challenging sometimes. So developing relationships is not always easy because for a relationship to work well, any relationship requires compromise, right? It requires being willing to not always have it your own way. And often what happens is that as we start to make those kinds of, develop those relationships and make the changes to have good relationships, sometimes we start to feel like we're losing our individualism. And it's not uncommon to just decide, you know what? I think I'd just rather go it alone. I don't want to deal with people anymore. I mean, if I'm completely honest, I started my business 20 years ago because I hated working for anybody else. I just didn't want to do it anymore. Yeah, it happened to work out for me, sort of thing, thankfully, but it wasn't, I didn't make that choice for good reasons. But by God's grace, it worked out anyway. Because we just feel like that we sometimes think we're just better off alone. And if we spend too much of our life alone, it becomes exhausting. And as we spend too much of our time alone, life is hard. And here's something that's really important to remember. You can be in a completely crowded room and feel completely alone. Some of the most alone times I felt in my life was surrounded by thousands of people walking down Fifth Avenue in New York City. Felt completely alone, surrounded by people. Because the only way we're not alone is when we actually have relationships. Body count does not equal relationship, right? Investments and being together. And the thing is that there's a lot of reasons we often choose to either go alone or not fully invest in our relationships. Oftentimes we've just been hurt too many times. That we try to trust people, and people let us down. And if that happens when you're young, that is especially hard to get over. And so we start to develop this attitude of, you know what, I think I'd just rather do it myself. But if we keep doing that, we often feel alone. There's a famous painting by the artist Roy Lichtenstein called Drowning Girl. It's from the early 60s. If you look at the picture, the girl is being overtaken by the waves. It seems that she's being pulled down, eyes filled with tears. And she screams out, "I don't care. I'd rather sink than ask Brad for help." How often do we do that? How often do we look at a situation and say, you know what? I'd rather go down alone than ask someone else to help me. Because I think we often convince ourselves that I can do it. I don't need help. I think it'd just be better if I do this myself. And we often justify that behavior in a lot of interesting ways. One that I've often heard and one I've actually used. I'm just a perfectionist. I think it'll just be, it'll be better if I do it myself, because that's the only way it's going to really be the way I want it to be. And what we often do is we have difficulty acknowledging that it's hard to let people in. And we have difficulty acknowledging that someone else might do it right, it just might be different than the way I do it. And we want to try to get past that, because I think, again, it always comes back to that issue of trust, that we just don't feel like we can trust people. And trusting people is hard, and when we trust people, we do get hurt sometimes. But if we develop enough healthy relationships, we have this strength and the ability to kind of get through those difficulties. And, I get it. It often feels safer just to not let people in. But that is exhausting, because letting people in is a risk. But there's also an incredible benefit to being willing to develop the relationships that can help bring us through life. Now, the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes puts it this way, and if it's not a book of the Bible we talk about very often, it's kind of considered a book of wisdom. It's actually kind of an odd book of the Bible, because the primary person speaking in it is very critical of life. There's nothing new under the sun. You've kind of seen everything. But then there's also other viewpoints that are like, no, there are good things in life. And so Ecclesiastes kind of goes through this back and forth. And this piece of wisdom about being in a relationship, it says, 2 people are better off than 1, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. And the reality is that we all fall sometimes. We all reach a place where we're in a difficult situation that we can't really save ourselves from. If you think of my story of climbing in Nevada, that was a real fall story. Right? I was really about to fall. But here's the cool thing. I had gotten myself in an incredibly difficult situation by my own choosing, wasn't drinking sort of thing. I was of my right mind, whatever that means, right? I actually made a conscious decision to do this, and I had gotten into a ton of trouble. But Steve kept me from falling. And here's the neat thing. Steve did not give me any ability that I didn't already have, right? I had to have the ability to do that climb on my own. But I had lost faith in myself. And I had lost the ability to trust myself to push forward, that I was literally choosing to do something I knew would kill me, rather than push forward to get to the other side. And Steve got me out of that. Steve broke me out of that. He broke me out of it by giving me encouragement and telling me that I could do it, and it helped me go forward. And because we had built a relationship over years, I believed him and I trusted him. And in fact, the writer of Ecclesiastes goes on and tells us that we are stronger when we are together. He says a person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but 2 can stand back to back and conquer. 3 are even better, for a triple braided cord is not easily broken. So as we come together, as we choose to live in community, we are stronger, we are healthier. And studies show that we are actually happier. We are happier even with all the difficulties of relationship. We are happier in community than we are when we're alone. So over the long haul, as we develop relationships with all their pains and all their problems, we live better. We achieve more in life, actually. We do more, we get more, and we are happier when we're in relationship. Why is that? Because being in relationship is fundamental to our nature. It's how we were created. But healthy relationships don't happen by accident, right? We have to be willing to work together, which means we have to be willing to let go of control. And for many of us, that's the hardest thing you could ask me to do, is to let go of control. But one of the things that's important to understand is that we don't really have control of the big things. We've talked about this before. We can't control the really big things in life. People we love get sick. People we love die. Right? Sometimes we lose a job for no fault of our own. Sometimes Sometimes someone we love leaves us, and we don't even know why. We can't control the big things. We can only control how we deal with the situations as they occur and how they're presented to us. And we want to invest in relationships so we have that strong support system around us so that when things do go wrong, we have people to lean on. We have people who can talk us through so we don't actually fall. But in order to do that, we need to actually be willing to compromise. We need to be willing to get together with people, respect one another, get to know one another. We need to be willing to be part of a team, not just an individual. But in order to do that, again, requires compromise. So the Apostle Paul actually gives us some advice on how to go about this. He says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility consider one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. So giving up your own personal interests for the interests of others. Not something that's easy to do, because what are we used to doing? We are used to fighting for our interests, trying to get what we think we deserve, because we're told that's how we're supposed to do it. But if we always do that, we don't develop relationships. So we need to make the effort to change it, because being in relationship is in our nature. It takes time. It takes tending. We need to incorporate relationship into the rhythm of our lives. And that's what we've been looking at throughout this series. It's this idea of how do we introduce a kind of regular daily rhythm into our lives so that we can live better, that we can have more fulfilling lives, so we can live life on purpose and live life that allows us to achieve our purpose. In order to do that, we have to be consistent with our nature. So as we've gone through the series, we've been putting together these building blocks that we would try to work in to each day. Remember, the first building block we talked about was take some time for relationship with God. 5 or 10 minutes a day. Say a prayer, engage with the Word of God somehow. If you've got an existing rhythm for that, keep doing what you're doing. If you don't have an existing rhythm for that, as we talked about, the YouVersion Bible app, right? 100% free, costs nothing to download. It doesn't try to take money from you once you're in it. Has thousands of reading plans in it that will actually enable you to read from the Bible 5 or 10 minutes a day, right? Even we'll play it in your car for you if you wanted to. Makes it super, super easy. And then last week we talked about a building block of personal wellness, to actually take time to process our days, understand our days, see what's going on in our days, and understand our emotions. And we said one of the best ways to do that is with journaling, to actually take 10 minutes or so a day and actually be willing to actually write down a couple of good things that happened that day, write down how you're feeling, process your feelings, understand why you're feeling that way. And we said that we would even make it easy for you. Remember last week we gave out little notebooks that you could journal in. We still have some left in the back. If you didn't get one, or you need another one, feel free to take one. Take these and just try journaling for a week. It will make all the difference in your life. So now what are we going to do next? We need another building block. So what we want to do is bring in a building block of family and relational wellness, that we need to do something every day that helps us to be connected in relationship. Now, Most of us have too many relationships to tend to every relationship every day. That's probably not very practical. But what we can do is do something relational every day, to intentionally make contact with family or friends or something every day to really develop that. Because, again, if we don't develop relational skills, it's like any other. We lose them and we have a harder time being in relationship. So the only way to have relational wellness is to spend time in relationship. And honestly, the only way to get good at relationships is to spend time in them and be willing to be awkward in them until you learn to be more relational, to learn to connect with that person that you're with. So we need to actually invest in a relationship. So my goal each week is to give you something you can tangibly go do to do this building block. And for this one, I have like 4. So you can pick the one that works for you. Some use technology, some don't, right? One easy way to kind of start doing something relational every day is take something you already do alone and do it with someone else. If you eat lunch at your desk, we all have 15 minutes. Just sit with someone else and just eat lunch with them for 15 minutes. I've talked about personal wellness. Take a walk. Just get outside. Walk with someone else. Just take a 10-minute walk with someone else. Cool thing about walking is you don't have to talk. Right? It's a way to be together but not talk, but you will eventually start to talk. Because that's a key part of developing relationships is lower the pressure. I had a good friend who had a very difficult relationship with his now 20-year-old son. And he would decide someday, his son almost never saw him. But periodically he'd walk into the kitchen, sit down, actually makes me so mad, I have to calm down, sorry. He would walk into the kitchen, sit down next to his son while his son's eating breakfast to head out. He would go, talk. How do you think the relationship is now, 5, 6, 7 years later? It's even worse than it was. We need to get that pressure off of our relationships. And it doesn't have to be a father-son relationship. All relationships are hard to start sometimes. Even for Bonnie and I, we have a really strong relationship, but if we're in a really stressful time, there are times I don't feel like talking. I talk a lot. And sometimes I just don't feel like talking. So we do things that let us be together that don't require a lot of conversation. You play a game. You play cards. We like the Lego. Discovered that during the pandemic. Didn't know it, but I actually like the Lego. And it's a cool thing. You're working on something together, but you don't have to talk the whole time. Or if you're in a game, you have the conversation about the game, which kind of takes the stress off. And then you can start to talk about other things at the same time. Simple things we can do to be in relationship. But there are things that technology makes easier. There are things like Zoom or FaceTime, whatever app you like. It allows you to connect with people even though they're far away. I've been in a men's group now for 5 years. Okay, we meet once a week, every week at 7 in the morning. We used to all live in Florida together, and we all met initially together. Now I live here. One guy lives in Pennsylvania. One guy still lives in Florida. The other guy lives in Oklahoma. And we use Zoom. And once a week, for an hour, we get together. And we have maintained this relationship for 5 years. And I don't expect it to end anytime soon. And it's really easy. And the cool thing about online connections is there's no travel time, right? It takes the exact time it takes. An hour meeting takes an hour. Imagine that, an hour meeting that only took an hour. How cool would that be, right? Everybody who is in meetings with me, I just want to point that out again. An hour meeting that only took an hour. How neat would that be? So now one more technology thing. Because one of the things I want to do is, recognizing that time is short. How can we kind of attend to 2 of these things at the same time? Like we talked about, taking a walk with someone attends to personal wellness and connects us in relationship. Well, we talked about the YouVersion Bible app helping us with our relationship with God. Well, I want to talk about it again, but in terms of relationships with one another. Now remember that, again, YouVersion Bible app, totally free, Bible.com. You can download it right to your phone, or you can use it on the web. It actually has a friend feature in it. Now you go, Bible app, what's it do with a friend feature? Basically, it allows you to do things from inside the app with someone else. Right? So when you open up the YouVersion Bible app, you end up in this homepage where it gives you like the verse of the day and that kind of stuff. If you look up here at the top, there's a little section that says community. If you choose community, one of the options you have is up here. add a friend. And so if you have the app and a friend of yours also has the app, when you click on this, you can actually go find them. The easiest way I have found to find them is to basically, if you know they have the app, just type in their email address that they've used to register the app, click that little search button at the bottom, and the person will show up. And then what you can then do is click on add, and it will send them an invite to be your friend. Now, they have the right to reject it, but if you're really friends, that won't happen, right? But if you're not, then you're a stalker, and they should reject your chances, right? But once you add them now, they're a friend. And now you can do things together. And one of the really cool things you can do together, if we head back to the home page here, remember that there's a section at the bottom called plans. And these are the reading plans I was talking about a couple weeks ago that take just kind of 5 or 10 minutes. If you go to the plans, you have the option to go find a plan that you're looking for. You can do it by book of the Bible, by topic. They suggest lots of plans as well. And there are literally thousands of plans in there. If you select a plan, when you open up that plan, you have that little button here which says Start Plan. Now, if you don't have any friends connected, it'll actually just take you right into it to start the reading plan. But once you have at least one friend connected, when you select that, this little pop-up at the bottom comes up. It gives you the option to do the plan by yourself or with a friend. And you can actually pick a start date. It will notify the friend that you've invited them to join you in the plan. You can all read it individually, but you connect with it together because you actually get acknowledgement that the other person's reading it. You can message them back and forth if you just want to say, hey, that one thing I heard really connected with me. How you feel about it? And you also could talk to them in person too, right? Sort of thing. So you can actually use this as another way to connect. So again, it's this thing, the YouVersion Bible app. I just can't say enough about it. You know, we've all been so conditioned to think that there's an ulterior motive in every app. This is one of the few apps that does not have any ulterior motive. They are not going to try to get money out of you. They're not going to try to get you to buy something. It's funded primarily by a large church in Oklahoma, as well as people who kind of donate to it as well. But it will not try to get money out of you. It just provides all those features because they're a church and they feel like helping people connect with Jesus is part of their job. And they have the resources to do it. So they do it. So I want to really encourage all of us that to kind of take a moment and just think through the relationships that you have in your life. And think of those relationships that are going well, and think about what's in common or what's going on in that relationship that's going well. And then think about those relationships that aren't going as well. And what could we do to kind of step into it? Because when we truly invest in our relationships, that's when we become a fuller version of who we are. We are more when we work together than when we try to work alone. And that's how we start to bring change into our own lives. And that's how we start to bring change into the world around us, by working together and doing all that we've been created to do.